Hello, welcome back to the Fruit of Grisaia. Okay, this is Yumiko's past. I don't know if I'm going to be able to keep up. I came to this place in search of connection, and every day I went home with nothing but disappointment. To be honest, those visits were painful for me. Sometimes I thought about how much nicer it would be just to stop coming entirely. But without my faint connection to my mother, I would be adrift in a sea of nothingness. I had no choice but to hold stubbornly to that single lifeline. I wasn't under any illusions that my conversations with Mom were doing her any good. In fact, her physician had begun to indirectly allude otherwise. Something along the lines of, "You don't have to come every single day, dear." But I was afraid. What if my mother did recover? If I abandoned her now, she might not take me with her when she returned to our old home. I didn't have many pleasant memories of that place, but at least there I was something other than an object of scorn. At least there I had something like an identity, and I couldn't return unless my mother took me with her. I hated myself for those selfish thoughts, but I didn't stop visiting. Pushing everything that I brought us there out of my mind, I clung stubbornly to the childish hope of a happy ending waiting around the next corner. The first year of my middle school life flowed by aimlessly. The only thing I had gained in that time was a bit of textbook knowledge. Apart from that, I hadn't learned a thing. I'm fairly sure my grades were good. I didn't want to give anyone the chance to criticize me on that front. Becoming a difficult child would be too risky. My place in the world was tenuous enough as it was. Thinking back on it now, I might have been happier just running away, but having spent my entire life shut up inside a box, the idea of trying to escape didn't even occur to me. Just as 1 year ago, I said goodbye to no one in particular and left the house alone. Nothing had changed. The scenery was the same. My life was the same. Everything in that country town was static.
奥様と旦那様を恨まないでやってくださいな。元はとてもお優しい方だったんですよ。
That morning, when Toshi-san handed me my lunchbox, I found myself grumbling a few rare complaints about my situation. The targets were mainly my grandparents. We'd been living together for many years now, and still they only spoke to me when it was absolutely necessary. Every moment I spent in that house made me feel as if I was slowly suffocating.
だけど、おじいちゃんもおばあちゃんもまるで私がいない。
貧すれば心も鈍する。今は由美子嬢ちゃんに構って差し上げられる余裕がないんですよ。家業の具合がようなれば。
そうなのかしら。
由美子嬢ちゃんはこんなにいい子なんですから、いつかきっとちゃんと見てくださいますよ。それまで
我慢だなんて、としえさんにはいつもお世話になりっぱなしで。
嬢ちゃん。
Nothing about our household had changed in years. As always, our lifestyle was dependent on Toshi-san's quiet assistance. She took care of us all without a single complaint. But I hadn't seen my grandparents show her gratitude for everything she did, not even once. Toshi-san's son, who lived with his wife in the neighborhood, clearly wanted to pry his mother away from her unrewarded servitude to the Kawamoto family. I'd overheard them having a heated fight on the topic. Our life was the same as it had always been, but beneath the surface it was slowly coming apart at the seams.
としえさん、もう来てくれなくなるのかな。
One day, I was making my way along a sloping road I had once walked with my mother, bombarded by the cries of cicadas. The area around my grandparents' home was a district with strict regulations on the height and variety of buildings, so the scenery hadn't changed much in the years since my mother entered the hospital. It was picturesque in a way that seemed to appeal to rich people. Many city dwellers had their second houses nearby, but I could never come to enjoy the scenery. It left me cold. The things that mattered to me changed for the worse, but the things I hated, the things that left me cold, never seemed to go away. Driven by frustrating, indistinct feelings of powerlessness, I began to walk faster. But with a flinch of surprise, my legs suddenly came to a halt.
やあ、おはよう由美子ちゃん。学校に行くところ？歩きながらでいいからさ、ちょっとおじさんの話に付き合ってもらえないかな。
After that moment of hesitation, my legs began to move once more, faster than before. Striding along almost like a race walker, I hurried down the road leading to my school.
お父さんがね、最近またちょっとおじさんの耳に入ってくるようなことをやっててね。それで騒ぎ。二宮さんって由美子ちゃんの知り合いにいなかった？ちょうどお母さんと同じぐらいの年の女の人なんだけど、もし知ってたら何でもいいんだ、おじさんに教えてくれないかな。それと俺は由美子ちゃんの家のことなんだけど、お母さんが昔お父さんと一緒に暮らしてた時にお手伝いをしていた人の。
おじさん。
お、なんだい由美子ちゃん。
Coming to an abrupt halt, I turned to face the man.
前にも言いましたが、私何も言いません。質問にも答えません。だからこうやってまとわりつくのをやめてください。
いや、だからだね由美子ちゃん。
名前で慣れ慣れしく呼ぶのもやめてください。失礼します。
やれやれ。父親譲りだな、ありゃ。
There was one significant change in my stagnant life. A reporter from a gossip magazine, whose job seemed to consist of digging for information on my father, was making a habit of loitering around me. I had first met him during the winter of my first year in junior high. At the time, I was still comically naive. He approached with kind words and sympathy, two things I wasn't used to getting, and convinced me to open up to him about my family circumstances. Pathetic as it was, I didn't realize it was all for an article until the moment my grandmother threw the tabloid in my face and delivered a furious scolding. Humiliated and bitter, I swore to myself to never again discuss personal matters with strangers or to trust their compassion. And despite it all, the very same journalist had the nerve to show his face in front of me again. Every time something happened, he'd come around sniffing for scraps of information. Speaking with him felt like brushing against my honest and perfect slimy leash. I marched ahead as quickly as I could, one fierce step after another, trying to shake off the lingering residue of our encounter. But then again, the place I was hurrying to wasn't exactly pleasant in its own right.
駅前のとこのさ、ロータリーのとこでヤマッチいたんよ。声かけたらあいつ逃げやがってさ。
あいつ最近付き合い悪いよな。彼女できたのかな、やっぱし。
嘘、山地誰かと付き合ってんの？
あれ、知らんかった？ C 組の木本いんじゃん。あいつどう？
It would have been much easier if they'd simply treated me like I didn't exist. Their clumsy method of ignoring me could sometimes become a weapon as sharp as any insult. I was well past the point of letting each and every sudden silence weigh on my mind, but it still wasn't exactly a pleasant feeling.
今日も来てんぞ。
あいつ成績はいいけど母親は入院してんだよな。
きっとあの子もさ、そういうのを。
The more I tried to ignore them, the more their whispers seemed to pierce their way into my ears. A year had passed since I first set foot in the school, By then, there wasn't a single person in my class who didn't know all about my family. There's no such thing as privacy in the countryside. The real nature of my mother's illness, which should have been kept absolutely confidential by the hospital, had filtered all the way down to middle schoolers' gossip. A purely academic question occurred to me. If this wasn't despair, then what exactly would qualify?
ここも逃げられぬ。
I opened my sketchbook beneath my desk, making sure that nobody could see. I'd kept up my art, and flipping through the book, it was obvious that my ability to depict fine details had come a long way in the last year. But all that really proved was how obsessively I'd sought escape, how deeply detached I'd grown from the world around me. Rather than pride, I felt something like nausea. Even my art was beginning to lose its value as a refuge. The room was pure white. Nothing had changed here, not the room, not even my mother's posture in her bed. It was as if I'd never left. Every time I walked in that door and saw her sitting there, I felt a surge of irrepressible pity run through me.
お母さん、来たわよ。
あ、由美子。いらっしゃい。
As always, I saw my mother in profile. As always, her gaze didn't turn to me. As always, she smiled quietly. But there was no tenderness in that expression. She was simply moving her face into that shape. It was an empty imitation of a real smile.
本持ってきたから。
I lowered a small bundle of books and weekly magazines my mother had requested onto the shelf beside her bed. They usually came with the mail, but sometimes I happened to run into a nurse who would hand them over to me for a more personal delivery.
そう。ありがとう。
Of course, the weeklies in question were respectable, established publications that largely kept away from the scandals and rumors circulated by the tabloids. We couldn't take the risk of her reading something like that article at Unwoman contributed to the previous winter. It undoubtedly would have set back her treatment, which was already proceeding slowly enough. My mother's newfound reading habits seemed to be part of an attempt to learn more about my father and the company he was running. Looking at that thick pile of magazines and books, I felt my chest tighten at her obvious desperation. Mom had never known much about the business. I would have been surprised if she could understand half of what she was reading.
ご飯残してるみたいね。看護師さんが言ってた。
そう。
今度、としえさんにご飯作ってきてもらうね。病院のよりはずっと美味しいと思うから。
そう。
Our interactions followed the same familiar pattern. I chattered away relentlessly while my mother muttered vaguely. Lately, even those monosyllabic responses had grown repetitive and careless. Almost as if she was beginning to treat the world with the same careless disinterest my father had shown her. It was a particularly difficult visit. My mother barely spoke, and I ran out of things to say very quickly. As the hours I spent at school had grown increasingly suffocating, I was spending more and more time wandering around in search of quiet places where I could be alone. These days, I frequently found myself lacking for stories to tell.
そろそろ帰るわ。
I rose quietly from my seat. My mother's face, as always, didn't turn toward me. It had been a truly pathetic excuse for a conversation, and I had little hope tomorrow would be any better. The things I wanted to say to Sam fell apart. The things I wanted to change stayed exactly as they were. Time no longer seemed to be flowing. It was a stagnant, brackish pool, and even treading water was becoming a struggle.
あなたが。
But as I prepared to leave, my mother spoke. That hadn't happened for quite some time.
お母さん。
That one word came as a complete surprise. Was she about to say something? Despite it all, I found myself pausing expectantly, hoping for some positive sign. Thinking the matter over calmly, it was foolish to even imagine her mood had suddenly changed, but I was so starved for a glimmer of hope that my mind latched onto the most optimistic possible interpretation. And then, with a few simple words, my naive, happy end scenario shattered like the fragile piece of glass it had always been.
あなたが男の子だったらよかったのにね。
My mother had never said anything like that before. No doubt the thought had crossed her mind, but she had even a shred of rationality remaining, the words could never have passed her lips. After all, if she were to say that, then nothing could ever change except to fall apart.
なんでそうじゃなかったのかな。
Something slipped out of my hands and clattered to the floor. A visitor from the company had dropped off a few jelly desserts. I'd been taking one from the shelf with a spoon. My mother had been skipping her meals lately, but I thought she might at least manage to eat that. Considering the season, a white peach jelly seemed appropriate. Maybe it would be easier for her to hold a spoon with a flat handle. Moments before, those were the only thoughts in my mind. They were gone now, obliterated by my mother's words so completely that it was as if they never existed. I ran as fast as I could, pushing my heart so hard I thought it might just sputter to a stop. Down the slope in front of the hospital, up again, onto a large, curving detour, past the station, around the corner from a small convenience store, into the remains of an abandoned factory. Only then, absolutely confident that I was alone, did I finally come to a halt. Gasping for air, I doubled over and held my trembling legs with both hands, propping up a body that seemed ready to collapse. The world flickered before my oxygen-starved eyes. My peripheral vision was dim and clouded, as though I was peering out from inside a tunnel. I could feel sweat pouring out from all over my body. My hair and clothes were completely disabled. I'd fallen at some point on the way over. There were scrapes on my knee and elbow. I pushed myself erect, a tattered mess of a girl. But I couldn't have cared less about any of that. After all, the tears streaming uncontrollably down my face were far more blatantly pathetic than my beat-up clothing. I could have endured it if she complained about something I could fix. I could have behaved better. There was still room for my grades to improve. I could have made myself more presentable. I could have cut every strand of hair to the exact same length. I could have learned to walk in a refined way at an absolutely steady pace. But no matter what, I was powerless to undo the reality of my own birth. Why did she have to choose the one thing I could never, ever change? My grandparents were right back then. If it was possible, she should have just tried again. She should have crushed that egg in the womb and pretended it never happened. Better that than this hopelessness, this irreparably broken life. Placing my hands against my breast, I pushed down with all my strength. How could a thing so totally beyond my control bring me such misery? I felt a dull, throbbing pain deep inside my chest. The painful pressure was accompanied by a slight twinge of stimulation. Even as I rejected it, my body reminded me that I was female. There was pain, but at the same time, I could feel the blood throughout my body beginning to stir in an unfamiliar way. Instinctively, I knew that it was something sexual, and I shivered with pure loathing. I hated my body. I hated the woman it was becoming. I didn't ask for that misery. I had no say in my crime. It was born with me. But so long as I lived, the pain would always be lurking somewhere deep inside me. only you'd been a boy. With one phrase, anyone could reduce me to nothing. I could study all I wanted. I could be the sweetest, most well-behaved person in the world. But so long as I stayed in that body, my naked vulnerability would never go away. I threw open my bag and took out my pencil box. Flipping open the lid, I retrieved the box cutter I use as a makeshift sharpener for my colored pencils. I wonder when exactly I began to find the act of cutting things apart pleasant. The clicking of the blade emerging from its sheath, the sound of something once whole being severed apart, those had become calming sounds to me. How wonderful would it be if I could slice away my femininity with a single box cutter? How wonderful would it be if I could sever my fate with the touch of a blade? How wonderful would it be if one movement of my hand could cut me free of all the troubles that coiled around me and choked the air from my lungs? As I cut savagely through the long, identical bundles of black, such thoughts ran through my head one after another. On the boiling concrete, speckled with the remnants of faded paint, clumps of black gathered. They fell like a vile rain until the sun-heated ground was covered in them. I could feel the gloom in my heart fading as I looked down into the darkness. But in its place, that dirty blackness left a layer of filth inside me that could never be cleaned away.
バカマジちげえってそれ。嘘つけ。それお前言わ。おいなんだ。何あの髪型。
男みてえだよな。
切っちゃったのかな自分で。かな。でもなんで。
あいつんちまた金なくなったんじゃないの。
まさか散髪代ぐらい出るだろうそれ。だよ
ね。
When I showed up for school with a hairstyle more appropriate for a boy, my classmates' reaction was exactly what I had expected. They made no effort to hide their amusement. I gotten that far uneventfully, not giving them much to work with, so perhaps there was a bit of a recoil effect. Whatever the case, my rough bob cut became an easy target for mockery and speculation. Of course, there wasn't a single person there who showed any concern for me. My grandmother was simply lost for words at first. Not that the aghast expression on her face meant she was worried about me.
そんなみっともないことはこれっきりにしてちょうだい。わかりましたね。
The one and only thing she was concerned about was how poorly my actions would appear in the eyes of society.
はい。ごめんなさい。
まったく恥ずかしい。
My grandmother, muttering about shame and humiliation, averted her eyes and disappeared inside the house. And for a very long time, I sat alone in my room, utterly silent except for the voices of the cicadas.
おう、由美子嬢ちゃん、どうなさったんですか。嬢ちゃんは何も悪くないのに、おかわいそうに。
Toshi-san was the only person who showed genuine concern for me, but it didn't make me feel any better to know I'd made the kind old woman worry. More than anything else, her sorrowful face made me regret my rashness. I'd gotten carried away by my emotions and lashed out, but nothing had changed. Nothing was going to change. For the sake of the one or two people who acknowledged my existence, I decided not to repeat my mistake. Toshi-san's death came soon thereafter. As the record-setting heat wave stretched on, the news was constantly occupied with stories of elderly people succumbing to heat stroke, and one day our neighbor, already past her 70th year, was among them.
すみませんが、お帰りいただけます。
そんな、せめてお焼香だけでも。
由美子さん、あなたも知ってるでしょう。母が倒れた原因。
それは
お給金が出るわけでもないのに、ねぎらいの言葉すらかけてもらえず、川本の家のために働き続けて。
申し訳ないと思っています。だから
だったらもううちとは関わらないでください。もう川本の家とは一切の関係をなくしたいんです。地元でも変な噂が立ってますし。
おい早苗、それぐらいにしておきなさい。
はい、それじゃこれで。
それだけでも言いたかった。
Your world is supposed to grow larger as you grow up. Mine seemed only to be shrinking ever smaller. I'd lost Toshi-san, and with her, the small place of refuge in front of our door had vanished as well. Just as I was on the verge of giving up, finally, at long last, a small ray of light broke through the wall of dark clouds.
お母さん、具合いいみたいね。
My mother was eating a mandarin orange served as a treat after her meal. Her expression was as placid as always.
今日はなんだか体も軽く感じるわ。
But for once, it didn't look like a mask she plastered onto her face. The peace in her eyes seemed real, something that had flowed naturally to the surface from deep inside her. Our retreat to the quiet of the countryside hadn't done much at first. If anything, our family tensions had probably taken a toll on my mother, but after many years of peace, it seemed her mind was slowly beginning to regain its equilibrium. The recent downturn had given way to weeks of steady improvement. Once you can meet your own needs, it becomes possible to worry about the needs of others. My mother had begun to give my questions real responses for the first time in years.
お医者さんもいい兆しだっておっしゃってたし、来週からはお薬も減らしていくっていうことだったから、それで。
We'd never been able to discuss her treatment, but lately it had become a safe topic of conversation. Specifically, her progress was so promising that a discharge from the hospital was coming into view at long last.
来週の月曜日、おばあちゃんと一緒に先生にお話を聞くから、そこでいろいろと今後のことも聞いてくるわね。あと、
由美子。
何お母さん。
由美子、ごめんね。お母さんひどいこと。あなたにこれだけしてもらっておいて、私男の子の方がいいとか。
お母さん、いいから。ほら、ミカ。はい、ティッシュ。食べた皮片付けるわね。
ありがとう。
いいのよ。お母さんは直すことに専念してくれればいいから。私そろそろ戻るね。また明日来るから。
そう、ゆっくりしていけばいいのに。
また明日来るから。
I stood up and waved goodbye with a quavery smile. My mother was still sitting in profile, but I could tell she was smiling in return. Holding that image in my mind, I slipped quietly out of the room. The moment I closed the door behind me, the world began to shimmer through a wall of tears.
お母さん。
I couldn't remember the last time my mother had showed that kind of concern for me. I don't know if she ever had. By the standard of a healthy parent-child relationship, I guess it was an insignificantly small thing. But for me, at that moment, those tentative words of compassion were enough to inspire overwhelming happiness. Happiness so strong that it couldn't help but break down and sob.
よくなる。よくなってる。
I spoke the words again and again, as if to fix that fact more firmly in reality. Perhaps Toshi-san had taken pity on me and stopped by to heal my mother on her way to heaven. Things were suddenly moving in such a positive direction that such thoughts seemed almost plausible. The next week, my grandmother and I went to meet with Mom's physician for an update on her condition. Normally, I was the only one who attended those meetings, but the progress was significant enough that he asked Grandma to come as well.
美佐子さんは間違いなく解放に向かっています。
Flipping through the papers in his hand, he gave us a detailed account of my mother's symptoms and current status. Not that I really needed to hear any of it. I already knew she was recovering. For someone who'd visited her every single day for years, it was impossible to miss the transformation.
それでもう娘は大丈夫なんでしょうか?
Once the doctor's explanation came to an end, my grandmother leaned forward, clinging to his arm as she spoke.
治療も順調に進んでおりますし、このまま退院の準備を始めてもいいでしょう。
The moment those words left his mouth, my grandmother lowered her head so deeply I thought she might topple out of her chair and prostrate herself on the floor.
ありがとうございます。ありがとうございます。
やめてください。頭をお上げになってください。
これで榊さんの家にも申し訳が立ちます。ありがとうございます。
Grandma continued to lavish her thanks on the doctor, as always doing her best to pretend that I wasn't even in the room. Mom's return to her husband would ensure that the Kawamoto business would continue receiving support from the Sakaki family. It was blatantly obvious from my grandmother's words that it was the sole reason for her gratitude. To the woman who brought her into the world, my mother was nothing but a defective political tool, but that only strengthened my determination to take care of her. Once the doctor's explanation was over, my grandmother went straight home without even stopping by to see her daughter's face. I heard her muttering the names of business partners to herself as she went. She was probably planning to hurry back to the house to inform them of the news. Then again, I wasn't exactly eager to have her visit my mother with that sort of an attitude, so if anything, her quick departure was convenient.
お母さん、来週退院が決まったわ。
Dropping a pile of magazines and books onto the shelf as usual, I spoke to my mother in a tone of sincere cheerfulness.
そう。じゃあ、おばあちゃんやおじいちゃんに迷惑をかける。何より、こうやって由美子に来てもらわなくても大丈夫になるから、それが一番安心ね。
お母さん。
私、由美子にこうして負担をかけてるのが本当に申し訳なかったから。
But at that moment, the burden didn't seem so heavy. My mother's feelings were more than enough compensation.
カーテン開けてもらえるかしら。
Just as requested, I pulled back the curtains from the window at Mom's side. A vault of blue stretched out beyond the panes of glass. It was the very picture of a summer sky. Compared to the heart of the city where the Sakaki house stood, the blue in that place seemed far more pure and vivid.
今日もいい天気ね。ここを出るときには一度屋上に上がって空を見てみたいわ。
Toshi-san told me once that my mother had always enjoyed gazing at the sky. She didn't look for anything in particular, just tilted her head back and watched. And when people asked her why, she could never find an answer. Memories from the day we first came to the town flashed into my mind. We'd walked hand in hand under a beautiful blue sky, but Mother's dull, lifeless eyes had never left the path below our feet. But she had finally remembered the sky. That could only mean she was on her way to recovery.
そうだね。 ここを出るときには一緒に空を見ようね。
そうね。
It occurred to me that I didn't have a single memory of the two of us doing something like that together. I found myself very much looking forward to the small event that would accompany my mother's discharge from the hospital. Everything was moving in a positive direction. The stupidly optimistic scenario I had sketched out in my imagination was coming closer and closer to reality. My mother's recovery produced clear changes in my own emotions. I'd barely spoken to anyone in the weeks since Toshi-san's death, but I was slowly beginning to communicate with those around me. My grandparents still kept their distance, but if I approached them myself using my mother as a pretext, I could at least get them to have a conversation with me. Mom's recovery was their primary objective, after all. They couldn't avoid hearing me out if I brought it up. Watching my grandparents interact with me despite obvious reluctance, I felt as though I'd achieved a small but significant rebellion against the people who'd spent years ignoring my very existence. I'm right here. I'm in an important position. More than anything else, that sense of meaning gave me strength. In school, the others still rejected my very existence, but that didn't bother me much anymore. I would be returning to the Sakaki house once my mother recovered. This whole school life would be over soon enough. The end was in sight. That suffocating feeling of entrapment was gone. No matter what they said about me, no matter how they laughed, it rolled off me harmlessly. Three days before my mother was scheduled to leave the hospital, I was hurrying to school through the rain. The drizzle that had begun a little after midnight was just picking up into a steady and heavy rain as I left the house. My umbrella wasn't enough to catch it all. Pausing for a moment, I glanced up at the angry sky beyond the edge of my umbrella. It was covered in deep black clouds from horizon to horizon, without so much as a patch of clear sky in between.
お母さん、憂鬱だろうね。
Since our conversation the other day, Mom had begun to spend a lot of time looking out her window. That was nice enough when the weather was clear, but staring up at a menacing sky like that might inspire a bit of gloominess just as her feelings were finally starting to hit an upward swing. I'd have to hurry to the hospital and cheer Mom up as soon as the school was over. With that thought, I began to walk again. And just as I reached the intersection between the road to school and the main street leading to the station, a familiar face appeared from around the corner.
どうもどうも。由美子ちゃん、久しぶりだね。元気して。
おじさん。
But it wasn't a face I was eager to see. I instantly recognized the tabloid reporter who had once clued over into becoming a source for an article that mixed fragments of truth with innuendo and lies. Standing under a large jet black umbrella that seemed to mirror the rain clouds above, he looked me over with a faint smile on his face.
いやー、しばらく見ないうちに可愛くなったね。お母さん譲りかな。それともお父さんに似たのか。
His words seemed to have grown even greasier and more presumptuous than before. When I walked past him silently, the reporter felt easily in beside me, keeping pace as though I invited him to follow.
ちょっと聞きたいことがあってね。またここに来るようになったんだけど、そこの喫茶店で話とか聞かせてくれないかな。
以前にも言いましたよね。私はあなたにお話しするようなことは一切やりません。
そんな。君のお父さんのことじゃないか。話すことなんかたくさんあると思うんだけどな。
ありません。父とはもう何年も会っていないんです。
It was incredibly unpleasant to have this man bring up that topic now. The Sakaki house was the invisible master I wish we all ordered in. I knew my current lifestyle was possible only because of his financial support, but I sometimes couldn't help feeling the powerful burst of resentment toward the father I barely knew. In particular, when people care of place, usually must have some kind of relationship.
もういいですか。付きまとわないでください。変な噂を立てられるので。
She does not have a very stable family. Stopping briefly, I spat out the clearest possible rejection and quickly turned around to leave. I couldn't allow trouble of this sort to arise so soon before Mom was to leave the hospital. There was no telling how speaking to this man for even the briefest of moments might come back to haunt me.
本当にそうなのかな。
The reporter, no longer trying to follow, called out to me from behind. His words were suggestive, his tone unusually serious. I came to a halt despite myself.
だから何なんですか一体。
So what does he want to ask her anyway? Rationally, I understand. It would have been the same either way. I know that it wasn't the cause of what would follow. But still, somewhere deep down inside, I can't help believing everything would have been different if only I had walked away.
そうもいかないんだよ。だってこの話、君に弟ができたってことなんだからね。
What? When I turned back to face him, the man was wiping at his ring-damp forehead with a knowing smirk on his face.
これに載ってるよ。もっとも、由美子ちゃんが読むような雑誌じゃないけどね。
The reporter reached out and presented me with a magazine, already open to a certain article. Practically grabbing it from his hands, I ran my eyes frantically across the page. In the moment I saw that headline, the blood in my veins seemed to freeze solid. East Beach Express President Sakaki Chiaki's illegitimate child, long-awaited son born to a mistress. Bold sans serif headlines, emphasized by sharp decorative flourishes, below the face of a man I hadn't seen in a while, lined up with the portrait of his unfamiliar partner. Paragraphs full of vicious words that I could barely stand to read, and at the very end, one sentence that plunged me below even despair. As I had doubted my ears in the hospital room weeks before, this time I doubted my eyes. Currently arranging for a divorce from his wife. Those few brief words, buried in the final paragraph as if they were the most trivial thing in the world, hit me with the force of a hurricane. I'd heard the rumors. I more or less understood that father was that sort of person. But there was no worse way to have those suspicions confirmed. Why now, when my mother is recuperating in the hospital? Why now, when she was finally getting better? Was this article even true? Many thoughts swirled chaotically through my head. My hands trembled and lost their hold on the hateful piece of paper.
うわ、ちょっと落とさないでよ。これだって一応資料なんだからさ。
The magazine fell to the wet pavement with a slap. As it hit the ground, the pages that had been folded back flipped around, revealing the cover. And as if to turn a dagger in my wound, one final piece of information was revealed to me.
この雑誌。
A tasteful work from a well-known painter, behind a number of carefully arranged headlines in a firm serif typeface. A weekly magazine, but one that clearly distinguished itself from the tabloids and gossip racks. A magazine of some credibility. A magazine my mother asked for every week.
というわけで、ぜひこの件についてお姉ちゃんとしてコメントを聞きたいんだけど、時間をってちょっとおい。
Charging off the sidewalk that ran alongside the prefectural highway, I sprinted all out along a farm road, slanting diagonally away through fields of green. The path didn't turn toward my school, so it offered an ever so slightly more direct route. But it was only a farm road. In places, it hadn't even been paved. It was an extremely difficult course to run on a rainy day.
お母さんがこれを読んだりした。
But I didn't have the luxury of worrying about that right at the moment. I needed to get to the hospital as soon as I possibly could. I needed to stop my mother. With the recent improvement in her condition, Mom had started to leave her room and visit the hospital store to purchase her own books and magazines. If the nurses were still delivering them with the mail, there was at least a chance they'd check for articles that might upset her. But it was hard to imagine the clerks in the shop would have been told to do the same. Halfway there, I could no longer muster the effort to keep my umbrella right above me. I let the rain strike me and focused all my attention on running. Water went falling with every heavy stride, slapping against my legs, soaking my skirt. The small ember of satisfaction warming my chest only minutes before heaven's water completely out of existence. I was cold to my very core.
ちょっと廊下を走らないでください。すみません。
My momentum barely slowed after arriving at the hospital. I understood perfectly well that running in the hallways was off limits, but the rule I'd always obeyed it mattered less than reaching my destination even a moment sooner.
お母さん、お母さん。
Turning a corner on the third floor, I finally entered the wing reserved for private rooms. A moment later, my feet came to an abrupt halt. There was something unusual going on in front of that familiar door. For a moment, I was simply bewildered. Three strange men in expensive suits were standing just outside my mother's room, talking to each other, just on the verge of entering. A vague but powerful sense of dread ran through my body like a jolt of electricity.
何をしてるんですか？
I shouted angrily as I approached. The man who'd been reaching for the door hesitated. Before I could continue, the white-haired man at the head of the little group preempted me with a question.
失礼ですが、どちら様ですか？
この病室の榊美佐子の娘です。あなたたちこそ誰なんですか？母に何のご用ですか？
Unperturbed by my fierce attitude, the white-haired man answered with a calm smile.
ああ、あなたが由美子さんですね。申し遅れました。私、榊家の顧問弁護士をしております。
顧問弁護士？
ええ。この度はお母様の件でちょっとお話がございまして、立ち寄らせていただきました。お母様はいらっしゃいますか？
The magazine article I'd read minutes before flashed vividly before my eyes. Currently arranging for divorce. In a heartbeat, my mind connected those words to this lawyer's sudden arrival.
会わせません。
は？
母と父を離婚させるために来たのでしょう。今母は病気なんです。そんな話なんかしたらどうなるかわかるでしょう。
由美子さん、それは誤解です。私たちはその件ではなく、今後のお二人のことについて。
嘘！さっき雑誌で見たわ。全部知ってるんだから。
The man's composed face distorted into a scowl at the word magazine. He must have been trying to reach us before that information did.
はい。
With a small movement of the lawyer's hand, the two men who'd been hanging back moved quickly toward me. They had me physically subdued before I could even register surprise. One man had slipped behind me and caught my arms in a firm full Nelson. The other stood in front of me like a wall, eliminating any chance of escape. I screamed desperately, but they weren't the sort of people to flinch at the cries of the young woman. The private wing was never a busy place. Today, it was entirely empty, and with the heavy rain drumming down outside, I doubt anyone elsewhere in the building even heard my voice. And of course, against the strength of 2 full-grown adults, a child like myself was completely powerless.
しばらくおとなしくしていてください。
The lawyer's voice had grown cold. It was the all-too-familiar voice of an adult.
榊美佐子さん、弁護士の津田と申します。お話があってまいりました。失礼しますよ。
His words were extremely polite. If anything, that made them all the more frightening. Ignoring my tear-choked plea, he pushed open the door to my mother's hospital room. I was the first to react. The bed sitting by the window, which had always been occupied before, was now empty.
不在か。まあいい。待たせてもらうこととしよう。
In contrast to the perpetually calm lawyer, I was filled with a profound sense of unease. The doctors always made their rounds at this time of the day. None of the patients were allowed to move around freely, much less my mother. They'd given her a normal space for the sake of camouflage, but by all rights she belonged in a room with bars on the window. Normally, it wouldn't be unusual to move a patient only 3 days from discharge back into the hospital's general ward, but my mother's condition was still delicate. Her physician had decided to handle everything cautiously until the very end. It just wasn't possible that Mom had simply stepped out at this time of day.
何ですか、あなたたちは。
The doctor had arrived for his daily rounds. For a moment, he simply stared at the bizarre scene inside the room with confusion in his eyes. Before the lawyer could stand to offer a greeting, I yelped out from the corner where the man had deposited me.
え？ついさっきまでここにいたと報告を受けていたんですが、そうだろう。
He turned to the nurse at his side for confirmation, a hint of alarm in his voice.
はい、確認しましたのでそう伝えましたが。
The startled nurse looked around the room as if expecting to find my mother hiding in a corner.
そんな。
It was all too much for me to process. Everything was moving forward smoothly only an hour ago, but now we were derailed, hurtling rapidly away into darkness and confusion, all of our painstaking work falling apart around us. I had to look for my mother. I had to keep her from finding out about that article. I had to get out of this room, away from these people. Countless thoughts stampeded wildly through my head, but there was just one thing that seemed clear to me. I couldn't just sit there waiting. Before anything else, I had to find Mom. And all of a sudden, I remembered.
ここを出るときには一度屋上に上がって空を見てみたいわ。
The words rang out so clear in my ears that for a moment I thought she was really there, speaking to me. Pushing my way around their man who'd been holding me in check, I slipped past the doctor and dashed out into the deserted hallway.
こら、待ちなさい。
I heard voices from behind. I ignored them. I didn't have any real proof, but there was nothing else for me to go on, so I had no choice but to cling to my intuition. Taking the stairs 2 at a time, I headed for the very top of the building. By the time I managed to struggle all the way to the rooftop, my breath was coming in quick, rapid rapid gasps, and my legs were burning beneath me. I felt about ready to collapse. After all, I'd sprinted from my house to the hospital, and then from Mom's room up to the roof with barely a pause in between. But my exhaustion was the last thing on my mind. I threw myself against the door with the last of my momentum, swinging it open wide. Alone in the dark, engulfed by the roar of the rainstorm, I screamed for my mother. It was coming down so hard now that the mist was rising from the bare concrete. Even seeing across the rooftop was a challenge. Naturally enough, given the weather, I couldn't make out any signs of human presence. But just as I muttered those words, a white shadow stirred in the darkness. It was a human being, a woman dressed in the white clothes of a patient, standing in the room. From her height and the length of her hair, I realized at once it was my mother. I splashed through the puddles to her side. She was staring blankly up into the sky, battered by the powerful rain, her entire body utterly soaked. I grabbed my mother by the shoulder and shook her frantically, trying to catch her attention. But her eyes were fixed on the sky. She didn't so much as budge. It was obvious at a glance that something was terribly wrong. Halfway through the sentence, I had noticed something lying on the ground at the very edge of my peripheral vision. It was flopping around in the wind. I had the feeling I'd seen it before, not that long ago, in fact. That cover, that tasteful painting, the work of a well-known artist, those headlines set in their restrained professional font. The magazine containing that article was lying at my window's feet. My hand slipped off her shoulder. I staggered backward, furiously on my feet. Why had this happened? Why did everything have to fall apart just when we were finally starting to move forward? Why was my mother standing there, soaking wet? Why did she have that blank expression on her face? Many questions bubbled to the surface of my mind. None of them had answers. They just sat there suspended in my mind, stagnating until they putrefied into a pool of solid sludge. My mother fixed her lifeless eyes on mine. I was startled. It was the first time for as long as I could remember that my mother had looked me straight in the face. But that was, without a doubt, the worst possible way for that to be broken. There was no light in Mom's eyes. The words she spoke posed a question, but there was nothing like actual curiosity behind them. It was the voice of a machine. I wanted desperately to convince myself she was joking. But no matter how I tried, I couldn't make myself believe it. The evidence before my eyes was simply too powerful. Mom's face was paler than white, and at the center of her wide eyes, there were two bottomless dark wells where her pupils had been. Those tiny spots of black seemed more vast and more profound than the black sky stretching out endlessly above us. I was standing on the edge of an abyss, and I was afraid. It felt as though I might fall into the pool of darkness and despair. I just feared. But I couldn't stop staring. I couldn't avert my eyes from the thing that was trying to swallow me whole. After all, she was the only person like me in the world who ever acknowledged my existence. I called out to her, praying the word might pull her back from across the chasm that separated us. But it was too wide. My voice was too weak. I was too weak. I shook away just one step. My heel slid backward across the toilet. And then, for just a moment, it felt as though my body was floating. Disoriented by a sharp impact to my backside, I didn't realize that I'd been pushed out of the way until I saw the doctor moving past me.
早く他の患者に見つからないようにベッドへ。
As I sat stunned on the wet concrete, they took my late-night mother in their arms. They were carrying her off like an oversized doll, away from me, to some place I didn't know. Pushing myself up off the ground, screaming, I ran toward her. I didn't make it 3 steps before another nurse caught me in her arms.
大丈夫よ由美子さん、大丈夫だから。いや、どこに連れて行くの。やめて。
Rising above the pattering of the black rain, a baleful roar filled the air. Crawling up from the depths of the earth, demolishing everything in its path. That sound, like a massive boulder tumbling relentlessly across the world, merged with the scene before my eyes and imprinted itself violently onto my heart. I tried to follow with my eyes as they carried her away. I strangled out one final cry. In response, the world filled with intense light, as though a dozen cameras had flashed at once. For a moment, I was dazzled. And by the time my vision returned to normal, there was nothing left to see. No, not quite nothing. On that otherwise empty roof, one waterlogged magazine remains. It was dissolving by now, paper melting away, ink pouring into illegibility, but my memory of the truth it contained wouldn't disappear so easily. My broken mother was gone. The doctor had smiled and told me she would be leaving the hospital was gone. I was absolutely alone. I crumbled with despair. My knees hit the ground first, then my hands, and my face. The wet concrete was pleasantly cold against my teeth. Maybe if I lay here long enough I could melt away and disappear, just like that magazine. The ground was cold, but my body was hot. I'd used up everything I had. I was empty. I'd given up on the very idea of living. The merciless rain continued to pour down on me, jet black rain, even though it wasn't me. The vicious dark water flew around me, picking up my body as if to swallow me whole. Oh no. Sometimes I hate this country has 4 seasons. I hate that this country has 4 seasons. Just when I'm finally starting to forget, an autumn wind reminds me of a whispered insult. Winter skies bring back cold and warmly memories. And in summer, when the sudden evening storms arrive, I'm torn apart with every clap of thunder. Again and again until there's nothing left. 1 year after my mother's relapse, things had quieted down. The commotion at the hospital created a bit of a stir around town, but it didn't take long for the talk to trickle to a halt. For one thing, the main character in the story was no longer arrested. And even our cold-hearted country gossips seemed hesitant to turn a gravely ill woman's condition into one of their nasty little jokes. I was absent from school for a week after the incident, recovering from the shock and a mild case of pneumonia, but my life eventually returned to its normal rhythm. That would be the superficial summary, at least. The trauma of reading that magazine article led to a dramatic downturn in my mother's condition. She was now suffering from acute memory loss. Her physician, my grandparents, my father, and me, we were all strangers to Mom now. Everyone she met slipped out of her mind within minutes. These symptoms were far beyond anything a local hospital was equipped to handle. Soon after the incident, Mom was transferred to a specialized psychiatric institution in North Kanto. Ironically enough, that divorce never actually came to pass. Perhaps my father backed off out of concern for his public image. That, or it was part of some conditional legal arrangement. I don't know. One thing, however, was perfectly clear. The connection between the Sakaki and Kawamoto houses had been severed. My two families spent the first months after the incident squabbling by proxy about legal issues in the care of their mutual burdens. In the end, the Sakaki continued to cover my mother's medical expenses, but they were no longer providing supplementary support to the Kawamoto family's farming business.
美佐子の件だけは責任を取らせたけど、これで支援もなくなって、どうするつもりですか、あなた。
つつましくやっていけばなんとかなる。すまんが、しばらくは我慢をしてくれんか。
歴史のある川本の家がこんな粗末な生活をするようになるなんて。しかもあの子の面倒まで見なければいけないなど、こんなバカな話がありま
ったく、なぜこんなことになってしまったのかな。
Even long after the matter was settled, my grandparents never seemed to tire of moaning about the unfairness of it all. And of course, as the easiest target for their bitterness, I once again found myself wedged between a rock and a hard place. I had the bare minimum required for a normal life. They always kept up appearances after all, but not a day went by when I didn't hear sarcastic, scornful words from the shadows. I went to a silent school and returned to a silent home. I'd lost my refuge, I'd lost my hope. All I could do was suffer quietly. This would be the point where a normal person might go bad. But I had been living inside a cage for so long that not even that choice was available to me. There was a time, just once, when I tried approaching a group of girls with that sort of reputation. The result was pathetic. In that country town, even the delinquents were mindful of appearances. They turned their backs on me and walked away without a word. Shunned even by those lowest on the totem pole, for a long moment I just stood there, rooted to the spot. And then I found myself looking up into the sky. It looked no different from the day I'd gazed out the window with my mother. Had Mom always been alone? Was that why she'd spent so much time watching something that never really changed? Now that I was well and truly isolated, I'd begun to think more about her feelings.
泣くこともできないのね。
It seemed like a moment worthy of a little sobbing, but it just wasn't happening. On that day in the rain, I'd used up my lifetime supply of tears. All that was left was a parched, withered husk of a human being. For one long year, I did nothing but watch the sky change slowly above me. But soon enough, I was pulled down into the muddy stream once again. Okay, I see a little more. I don't know where this is going. It was a little before the start of summer vacation. Our teacher had fallen ill that afternoon. The final lesson was replaced by study hall, which I spent gazing dully out the window. That exercise in pure boredom finally complete. I was walking sluggishly down the road toward my grandparents' house, just turning the final corner onto the street. Something was wrong about this picture. A shiny black luxury car was parked along the thickly hedged road in front of our house. The Kawamoto family didn't own a private automobile. My grandfather apparently had one back in the days when the business was doing well, but it was one of the first things to go when the recession hit. It's crazy seeing how all this is affecting this family. The negotiations within the Sakaki family had always been held in the business office by the station, so it was hard to imagine why such a car could have possibly come.
誰だろう。
For a little while, I dawdled outside, staring curiously at the car with its thickly tinted windows. But after 2 or 3 minutes, a voice called out to me from inside our house.
遅かったじゃないの、由美子ちゃん。早く上がって。
I was startled. The friendly attitude was one thing, but it was the very first time since I'd arrived that my grandmother had called me by name. She wouldn't have done that without a very good reason.
はい。
After quickly removing my shoes, I let her usher me into the parlor. It was the first time in a good 4 years that I'd been in that room. The instant I crossed the threshold, 5 men in black suits stood up simultaneously and bowed in greeting. As I blinked in bewilderment, my grandmother spoke, a strange little smile twisting her face.
ほら、そこに座って。由美子ちゃんが話に入らないと進まないことなんだから。
And with that, she sat me at the head of the table. The dusty air of the rarely used parlor tickling my nose, I looked around me. All 5 of the men had deeply serious expressions on their faces. To be honest, I wanted nothing more than to run away.
一体何の話なんですか？こんな急に。
As soon as the question left my mouth, a man seated to my left took control of the conversation.
お父様、榊道明様の命により、由美子様をお迎えに上がりました。
お迎えに？
はい。お父様は昨年の一件で、由美子様をとても心配していらっしゃいました。
What on earth was this man talking about? After the incident with Mom, my father hadn't showed up in this house even once. I understood that he had a busy professional life, but he didn't even bother to send a message or place a phone call. Now they expected me to believe he was worried. Now, after a full year, ridiculous. It was mystifying Grandma had even let them in the house, let alone with that simpering grin on her face. Didn't she understand this was nonsense? But soon I discovered that my grandmother's reactions were perfectly lucid, for reasons that had nothing to do with any of that.
よかったわね、由美子ちゃん。これでいい学校に通えるし、お父様とも一緒に住めるのよ。
いろいろあったが、これからは何の心配もしないで暮らせるんだ。よかったな。
お父様からもまたこの家を助けていただけるそうで、本当によかったわ。
Now I understood. This was a question with no choices. My grandparents had decided the answer beforehand, and were now unilaterally forcing me toward it. I was so profoundly astonished at their naked self-interest that I couldn't even manage any anger, but it's not as if snapping at them would have achieved anything in the first place. Remaining with them was probably never really an option.
わかりました。すぐに準備をしてきます。
When I stood from my seat, my grandmother spoke in a sickeningly sweet voice.
あらあら、そこまで急がなくてもいいのよ。榊家の方は明日もまたいらっしゃるというし、それまで。
いえ、結構です。今いらっしゃってるのなら、その車に乗っていきます。
あら、そうなの？由美子ちゃんがそういうのなら仕方ないわよね、あなた。
ああ、もちろんそうだ。由美子のいいようにすればいいからな。
I was about ready to vomit. From my grandmother's words, it seemed clear that Sakaki had come with a clear offer in hand, my return in exchange for restored financial support to the Kawamoto business. My grandparents had considered me a burden from the start, so I imagined they didn't exactly hesitate. It probably felt like selling some piece of junk from the backyard for a huge sum at auction.
汚らしい。
I tried muttering the words, but couldn't manage much conviction. After all, I was scuttling around the same sordid web. How could I complain? I wasn't working for my food. I pulled all the clothes out of my chest of drawers, threw them in onto my tatami mat, and scowled down at them.
さようなら。
I wasn't speaking to my grandparents, the house, or even my mother. It was a farewell to the person who had lived here, idly wasting day after empty day, accomplishing nothing but growing older. I spoke those words to confirm a simple fact. That room was nothing to me. It held nothing of me. One by one, I cut the clothes I wore in the place to shreds. The expensive-looking children's clothes I brought with me, the generic ready-made supermarket clothes my grandparents had bought me when the need arose, my middle school uniforms. My face in a motionless mask, I carefully chopped them into tiny pieces.
これで終わり。
My preparations were complete. Grabbing the scrapped clothes with both hands, I shoved them right back into my chest of drawers. It took less than a minute to toss my everyday belongings, art supplies, and sketchbooks into my bag. Just like that, my life in that place was over. I didn't look back. Jeez. This is really getting... Her life has changed so much because of